I mentioned in the last movie that JSON can exist in its own file. Now, when you're receiving JSON text from an external source, such as a server, it comes as a string of text. That's how you receive it. But if you want to keep data separate and you're not grabbing that data from an external source, a good way to do it is to put the data in a JSON file. This is a technique that I've used numerous times. Now, in the last movie, we quickly looked at a JavaScript object, which we converted to JSON text. It was a little more complex JavaScript object. We didn't look at the object in detail. What I'm going to do in this movie is I'm going to set up that content in a JSON file so that we can look at creating a separate JSON file. Now, let me just paint the scenario before we start doing that. So based on some of the coding work we've been doing previously in this course, let's say I want to create a quiz, and this quiz has multiple questions. For the sake of this exercise, it has 3 questions. I want to keep that data for those questions in a separate file. Then I want to load that in and load it into the question as the user works through the questions. The reason I want to do that is the client I'm creating this for may want to have this translated in different languages. Much easier to do if all the data for that is in a separate JSON file. So that's the justification for it. Plus, it can make some other things more manageable. So let's jump to Sublime and we'll get started on creating this JSON file. All right. First thing I want to do is create the file. So I'm going to choose New File, and then let's just save that. And I'm going to put it in this folder, JSON. And I'm going to call it Data. And the extension for a JSON file is JSON. Now we can begin setting up our data. So to start that, it's simply a matter of putting in our curly braces, because we want this to be an object. When we translate it into JavaScript, we want it to be a JavaScript object. So we'll start with curly braces. When you start a JSON file, begin it with curly braces. Now, this quiz, we have some settings that apply just to the quiz. And then we have 3 questions we need to enter. And so I think I want to set up those settings first. Now, first is the number of questions. So I'm going to set up a name value pair that stores information for the number of questions. So the name, let's make it num questions. Now remember, in JSON, we need to put that in double quotes. So num questions. And then we separate it with a colon, and then the value is going to be 3. Now, before we do the next name value pair, we need to put a comma. We need to separate all data with a comma. I also want a setting that allows me to control how the questions are presented, whether they're linear in the order I entered them or whether we present them randomly. So let's do this, random presentation. And we're going to set that to true. So right now it is random. So I have 2 settings for my quiz. Now I can begin entering the questions. So the name for that name value pair is questions. Now the value is going to be an array. And I have a lot of data to put inside that array. So I'm going to press return so that I can begin putting the individual questions inside of that array. And each of these individual questions are going to be another object. So I'm going to indent that, and I'll start by putting in curly braces. So first thing we want is the stem of the question. This is what's being asked the learner. And the first one is, I'm just going to copy these in so I'm not spending so much time typing. What are the 6 primitive data types? I need to put more data with this particular question, so I put a comma, and I'm going to enter the weight. This is how much the question is worth. Whoops, colon there. And that's going to be worth 1. And then the type of question it is. So I can have different types. This one's going to be a fill-in. So that's a string, so I enclose that in double quotes. Another comma. And the last data value I will put in here is the answer. Oops, that should be a colon. And paste that in. Now, I'm not going to put a comma here because I'm done with the data for that particular object. However, I do want to put another question. So I need to put a comma between these objects. So I'm going to create another object below it. So I'll just copy that one and put one more below it. Put in a different stem. The weight is still 1. It's not a fill-in question. It's true, false. So let me put that as the type. And then the answer in this case is a Boolean, true. Or I'm sorry, false. And then one more question. Let me copy in the stem for this question. Weight of 1, it is a true, false, and it's also false, the answer for that. I don't have any more questions, so I'm going to remove the comma at the end of that object. Now, if I had another setting that I wanted to include in the quiz, I could put that after the questions, and I would just put a comma after the end of the square bracket, press return, and I could put a title for the quiz. Just put something like that. So this gives you an idea how you can structure your JSON file. Very similar to a JavaScript object. The main difference we have to remember is the double quotes that we're putting around the names for the name value pairs. And we also need to make sure we use double quotes whenever we do a string. Let me go ahead and save this, and we'll move on to the next topic.